rubbish, that doesn't feel right in a way. But we go through the formalities, which means that I will show you what I would like you to remember. I'd like you to remember something about the monastery. I'd like you to remember something about some of the islands around the monastery. I want you to meet some of the saints who have lived around the monastery. And once we get the formalities done, and once the beautiful photographs will be over, hopefully we can have a conversation based on your questions, based on things that you really care about and that are important to you. The presentation I'd like to share with you today has two parts. First, I'll show you a few photographs, just briefly, things that concern the monastery itself. So I'll share with you some photos about our main church, some photographs of the ruins near around the church, and then finally I'll share with you our hope, which is to purchase this tiny little house by the monastery, by the church. Once that is gone and out of the way, I'll move to what I think is the important part and the interesting part, where I want you to see photographs from 3 different islands around Mull. The island where St. Brandon lived, the island where St. Columba and St. Audun and all those wonderful monastics who traveled to Iona with him lived, and then finally the island where St. Kenneth lived. So basically by the end of the day, or at least this afternoon, this morning, you will know something about the monastery and hopefully something about these 3-4 main saints of ours. And God willing, the machines will work as well. Sometimes they do, other times they don't. It's a bit strange to describe a photograph when you can't see it. So, but I've done that. Don't worry. Everything, I've gone through everything. So, well, Anyway, we'll start with a map of the United Kingdom. At least this is the United Kingdom as we know it today. God only knows what it will look like following Brexit. So, not to judge politics in any way, but a dreadful idea is always a dreadful idea. So, the United Kingdom, or the British Isles, let's put it that way, consists of just a bunch of islands. It's quite simple. It's just a series of islands put together. The main bigger islands are Great Britain, which is the big one, and then Ireland. There are 2 different islands. What we call the United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, one of those 2 islands, and North Ireland. The area we are interested in, because that's where most of the saints I shall speak to you about have lived, is actually Scotland, this part north, and more particularly the islands around Scotland. And you'll see there are 3 main archipelagos. You've got Shetlands and the Orkneys to the north of Scotland, and then to the west of Scotland, north of Ireland, we've got the Hebrides. And they are separated as Outer Hebrides and Inner Hebrides, depending how far away or how close they are to the main island, Great Britain itself. You'll hear me, for instance, when I speak about St. Columba, that he came north from Ireland. And I want you to have some sort of visual representation. So all these saints, all the saints who lived in the Hebrides were actually, the first generation at least, Irish. And they traveled from their home country, from Ireland, they traveled north, that's why we're saying that, into the Hebrides. See, the distance is not quite big actually. And that entire first generation was entirely Irish. There's another reason why I want you to see this map, apart from explaining where Scotland is and where the Hebrides are. And that has to do with the way in which Christianity arrived to the Isles, to the British Isles. This is very important, and in many ways, if you are to reduce everything you hear today to one single sentence, if I take my pick on what you remember following this presentation, it would be this information. The south of England received its first Christian missionary from the west of Europe via Rome, which would be somewhere there, whereas the south of Ireland received its first missionaries from the north of Egypt, which would be there somewhere, traveling through the Mediterranean Sea and landing to the south of the island. From here, they traveled north to the north of Ireland, and from here in the later centuries they travelled even further north to the islands, and from the islands into Scotland itself. And eventually the two types of Christianity, as similar as they were, because again, keep in mind, we are talking about the first millennium. I don't want you to make too much of the differences. This is not about bad Rome and good Egypt. Because at the time, there weren't really, no, I want to underline that because I don't want to end up being used in some way in this strange war that goes. I'm completely not interested. In the first millennium, particularly the first half of the first millennium, there weren't that many differences. And whatever seeds of differences were already present in their theology, they hadn't borne fruit yet. So people believed pretty much in the same things, in the same ways. Christianity was one, and everybody was happy. So anyway, let's keep that thought. We were all happy. But even if they were happy, in the 7th century, when the missionaries from Rome, from Western Europe, traveling north, arrived in what we call today Northumbria, this region here to the northeast of England. The missionaries that arrived in the south of Ireland from Egypt, what we call the Orthodox missionaries, had already traveled through the north of Ireland, through the islands, through Scotland, and they started to go south until they met. So in the late 600s, 7th century, there was a synod overseen by Saint Hild or Hilda in her monastery at Whitby. And already there, in the 600s, the differences were so great or so visible between the two churches, two types of Christianity, that they actually had to split. And there was a break. And that break and the lack of support from the Christians to the south of Great Britain, combined with the attacks of the Vikings, meant ultimately the demise, the destruction of what we call Celtic Christianity. So remember this. What we call Celtic Christianity, all the saints that we are going to mention, are influenced and have received their Christianity from Egypt, from the Egyptian fathers. And that is very important for us as Orthodox because it underlines that connection between Orthodoxy in the first centuries and the Celtic Church in the first centuries as well. And one more footnote before I go into the photographs. We use these things, these words, these concepts, Celtic saints, Celtic church, Celtic Christianity. And we have to understand that whereas we do use them and they're very useful because they help us to know what on earth we are referring to, the reality is that they're all made up and they don't really describe a reality per se. There was never in the history of Christianity a Celtic church. There was never something called Celtic Christianity. They themselves would not perceive themselves as one group of Celtic saints. They belong to different tribes. They belong to different kingdoms. If you read the lives of these saints, most of them are sons or daughters of kings and queens. And you end up wondering, how on earth do you have hundreds of kings and queens in this little region over here? Well, you do, because at that time, every tribe would have a royal family, a king and a queen. So I think we are projecting a great deal of what we understand of the world today onto their world, 15 centuries ago. And that's useful because it gives us the tools to talk about them. How else would we refer to them if we couldn't generalize and say Celtic Church or Celtic Saints? But on the other hand, it's important, for the sake of truth really, that we understand we made up these notions just for our own use. I had here. So the actual island where the monastery is located, Isle of Mull, is part of the Inner Hebrides. So this is the region we are going to be focusing on. And this is a map of the actual island. Those of you who've come to our pilgrimages know you leave from Oban, which is the main port in the Hebrides over there, and you take a ferry into Cranium. It's quite a short ride, but it still takes about an hour with a very large ferry. And then from there you can travel either to the north and visit Tobermory and the sightseeing there, or you can go south, and there are reasons why we go south. Now, on the island, the monastery has two locations, and that's how
I think, I mean, we know nothing about our future, but this is what I envisage, that this is what the monastery will look like for quite some time, at least as long as I am alive. At Kilninian, which is marked on the map, we have a church, our main church, and we are now hoping to buy a small house with 3 bedrooms, which would be used by myself and the future community, so we can actually celebrate at Kilninian. Kilninian, by the way, means the Church of Ninian. If you travel to Scotland, or in Ireland, or even in Wales, you'll see all these killing places. You know, kill Patrick, kill Martin, kill Bridget, kill all of them. It actually means church of that particular saint. The word church, or kirk, comes from kill. The ancient tiny little word. So this is where we have our church, and this is where, at Unesco, about 2 hours away driving, we have our pilgrimage house. This is where the community was based last summer, hoping that we would eventually be able to move here. But this is where we have our monastery house, our pilgrimage house, and there's a reason why we bought it there. Very close to our house, about 15 minutes away, is this tiny island, which is called Iona. And this is where Saint Columba lived. This is where the famous monastery of Iona was located, and this is pretty much the center of our pilgrimage. We go twice to Iona in that week, then we take a boat and we travel to other places from Finnefort, which means the beautiful, the fair port, from where you can get the boats. So keep in mind this thing, the monastery has a church and a house, God willing, at Kilninian, the actual place of the monastery, and we have a pilgrimage house in Bunesson. And I'll show you photographs of both. This is taken from just in front of the monastery church at Kilninian, and I include this because I want you to see the cemetery, which is where the monastics who lived there from the 500s and everyone who's lived there and died there ever since is buried. I also want you to understand how close the ocean is, because the ocean has been very present, even in the short time that we've had the church. We've had the church for a decade now, and in that decade, it has already been, well, almost destroyed once. When the trees nearby, we have such trees close to the church as well, they just collapsed and fell on our roof, so we were forced to just replace the whole roof. But this is the actual church as it looks today. This structure was put up in 1755. The foundations of the monastery and of the church go back to either late 500s or early 600s. We know that the monks who lived there, we established the community, came from Iona. And we know that with certainty, because we still have the documents, they still exist, that list Kilninian on the Isle of Mull among the properties of the monastery on Iona. So they must have perceived it in what we call today a skeet of the main monastery, or a metochion of sorts. And we know that this is the place where the first hermit lived at Kilninian. The church is old enough to be listed as a historical building and to be included in the National Heritage, which is a blessing in some ways and a huge disadvantage in other ways, because it comes with all sorts of limitations, legal limitations, concerning what you can do, and also with a lot of extra expenses, because everything you can do has to be done by certain people with certain materials. So that's actually a tricky one. Everything in Indian begins with this very, very humble place, which is nothing but a spring. It's called St. Ninian's Spring or St. Ninian's Well, and it has been dated and mentioned since the 400s, so before the first monastics came to live at Kilninian. It's dedicated to St. Ninian, and it's actually historically important because in the life of St. Ninian, we know that he did missionary work in the Isles, but we don't quite know where in the Isles. But there are some places where the topography still carries the name of the saint. So you have St. Ninian's Well on the Isle of Mull. You have St. Ninian's Hill in other places in the Hebrides. So you can more or less kind of say this is where he's been because his memory has been kept. Because of the saint and because of this well, which was known in its time, and I still very much believe it is a miracle working site I always bless everybody who comes with water from there. We use the water to drink. We use the water when we, make holy water. And because of that well, the first hermits moved to the site, and then around them, the disciples came, and the first community was built. And that's pretty much the story of all communities in the Isles. This is an important photograph, and some of you have seen it. It's important because it shows you the traces of the round beehives that existed around Kilminium in the 500s and 600s. They are perfectly covered through the summer by the vegetation. There's an invasion of fern on the island, as you who have been there know. But in December, all of that is dead. Everything, all the tree leaves, everything has disappeared. So they take these geological sort of surveys with helicopters, and they take these aerial photographs, black and white, and that's when what's buried underneath is still visible. And because of the presence of these beehives or ruins of beehives all around, the site is again listed as a historical site, and it's also included in an area that probably in America would be known as a national reservation or something. Yeah, national, like Yellowstone. In the UK, it's called an area of outstanding natural beauty. So what we're trying to do is establish a monastery and potentially build in Yellowstone, if you had in Yellowstone a building from the 500s. And that comes with a lot of legal issues, as it should actually, I'm not complaining, as it should. This is what I was telling you a bit earlier. Some of these trees, you can't see them anymore because after it happened I took care of them. Actually I wonder, this is what they look like today. So that enemy has been defeated, but there are plenty others around. So I try to behave in my relationship with them and just kind of cut their hair every summer and hope for the best. But they had collapsed on the roof, and they affected this side of the roof. We were hoping that we'd move in, we'd repair that part of the roof and get it done with. But once we moved in, we found out that the entire structure was affected, and that the timber work that was keeping the roof up was actually the original timber work from 1755. That's almost 3 centuries. That's wood in Scotland on an island, constant rain and humidity. You do need to replace them at least every 3 centuries. So, 2 or 3 times a millennium does it good. So that's what we had to do, and that's why for about a year and a half, both the church and the there's a very small vestry room, we call it, behind the church. It just was covered, everything was covered with plastic until we could replace the timber work, and then on top of the timber work actually put back the tiles, which is another story, because the tiles themselves have to be from the period of the original tiles. So I had to come up, not me, the builders, with tiles from the 1700s. How do you generate tiles from the 1700s if you don't live in an American movie and you travel back in time? Apparently, if you can't, they do allow you to kind of imitate, by imitation. But in the Isles, you do find them. It just takes time and it takes money. Because there are all these other churches, all these other homes that are now ruined beyond repair. So if you do travel and you put in the effort, you will find 40 or 50 in one place, 40 or 50 in another place, and then you will have eventually enough to put up a new roof, which is made up of 300-year-old tiles. But by the grace of God, we managed to do that. And then eventually, after 2 years and a half of this is the small vestry room I mentioned to you. Actually, you can see here, when the tree fell, even the what do you call it, the belfry, the bell tower was taken down. But then, thank God, we put it back and it's okay. Okay, so I mentioned to you that we are hoping to buy a property now, close to Kilminium. This is the church. This is the cemetery that I showed you. This area around the church, about 5 acres of land, we bought about 2 years and a half ago. And these are the only 3 houses that exist close to the church. This is the old school, which I really hope we shall, I mean, God only knows. But I would prefer not to have it. I would prefer not to have to buy that particular property because it is very, very old. And I've already had to deal with one old historical building. I really wish I don't have to deal with another one. But then God, does whatever He wants. So, however, to the left of Kilninian, there are these two houses, and they're much smaller. They each have 3 bedrooms, but they're more recent. They were built in the decade since we had the church. I think the two families who moved there were quite optimistic, and they thought, oh, we'll move to the island and we'll have this kind of romanticized version of our lives. They put the money, they put the effort, bless their souls, and then about 8-9 years later, they are desperate to sell and get out of the island. Because this is the western side of the island. This is where all the winds hit, this is where all the storms hit. It's not, and you don't have any neighbors. I mean, there isn't really any village nearby. And by village, I mean a cluster of at least, 10 houses. There is no nurse, there's basically nothing except these few homes. So this house has been put on the market in January, just as I was preparing to fly to the US. And we put an offer on it. We found people in the US, thank God, who lent us the funds. So if everything goes okay, at the stage where the lawyers ask for documents and they have to check the documents and all that thing I don't understand anything of, but you have to get through that and you have to spend a lot of money with the lawyers. If that goes okay, that means that this summer, really, we can move, and by we I mean myself and anybody who will join me in this house by Kilninian and just have the proper monastery where it should have been from the very beginning. But in the meantime, so again, this is Kilninian and the small house to the left. See what I meant about being on the west side? This is how the winds come. This is beautiful America. Here somewhere is even more beautiful Florida, where all the tornadoes or whatever you call them get formed. All of them, each and every one of them, once they cross the Atlantic, guess where they break? So every time we have a storm, I bless everyone who lives in Florida. Anyway, so that's where they hit all the storms. So nobody in their sanity would live on the western side. Everybody lives in the east, so on this side. Our monastery, our pilgrimage house is in Bunassa. And I mentioned to you before something about an area of outstanding natural beauty or a national reservation. That starts at Calgary Bay, which is, by the way, where the city of Calgary in Canada takes its name. Because a lot of people from Calgary Bay in the 1700s ended up in that particular area and they formed a city with that name. And then it goes all the way down until here. These are the Mulls, or the mountains, or the wilderness of Mull. Nobody lives here. And this area is the ugly area, which looks pretty much like this. I am so frustrated that is the ugly side of Mull that I thought I'm going to include a photograph from the ugly side of Mull, not the beautiful side of Mull. And this is close to Bunassa. This is where our pilgrimage house is. And this is the pilgrimage house. It can accommodate exactly what we need. 10 people in 5 bedrooms. We are there for a week, and every single day we take either our cars or a motorboat or a sailing boat, and we go to another island or another holy site, and we pray to a Celtic saint. And this, I always point this out, this is not photoshopped. This is a real seal, because we have the creatures all around. I'm not a big fan, so I should say that in the beginning. I'm not a big fan of seals or puffins. So I don't know why I ended up there. They are everywhere. We don't have a lot of neighbors. And the neighbors that we do have, there are a few houses here on this side of the road. Actually, I do wonder if it's connected with us moving there. I do hope not. We had 3 neighbors. One here, and they've sold. One here, they are selling. And there's a third one here, and they've just announced that they will be selling. So, God only knows. But there's potential to, build an empire, if you want. And behind our pilgrimage house, there's this little shed, which we turned into a small, what do you call it, a chapel. And it's dedicated to Saint Cisoes the Great and Saint Brandon the Navigator. Saint Cisoes the Great being one of the greatest desert fathers, so one of those very early Egyptian saints, and Saint Brandon is the first one who landed in the Hebrides. So I wanted again to underline this connection between Orthodoxy in Egypt in the first centuries and Orthodoxy or Celtic Christianity in Ireland in the first millennium. It's very simple inside. Everything is made of wood. These are the icons, Magiška, that we did, and they are mounted on both sides. So from the outside, you kind of see icons as well. I thought, they won't come inside, but they have to go to work, so they will see some icons. And yeah, this is what it looks inside. That was the monastery. I will not tell you anymore, I won't bore you anymore unless you have questions at the very end. Now, I told you I want to speak to you about 4 saints, Saint Brandon, Saint Columba, Saint Oran, and Saint Kenneth. I'm beginning with Saint Brandon and not Saint Columba. I was just about to tell you the truth, but I'm not going to. I'm beginning with him because I love him more. Really, that's the reality, but that's a stupid reaction to that. But it's the truth. I mean, I feel he's closer to me in a way. But he's also historically the first one who landed in the Isles that we know of. And he's also the first one to build a monastery, the ruins of which still exist to this day. So there's a reason, a practical reason why I could begin with him. If you take a motorboat, as we do in our pilgrimages, from this bay, and you travel south for about an hour, here is a tiny little island, which in Gaelic means the rocky place of the saint. And it's quite obvious why it's called that, because it looks pretty much like that. It's just rock with some sort of vegetation on top of it. And it's also rocky underneath. So that's why we have to leave the motorboat somewhere there, and then we take a plastic dinghy like this, and we slowly and prayerfully kind of approach the landing place. People are very happy. This is when they go away. This is when they say, "You have survived yet another day." But on this island, in 541, there was a fully functioning monastery built by Saint Brandon the Navigator. And it has the typical structure of all Celtic monasteries in Scotland, in the Isles, or in Ireland. On top of the hill is the ancient cemetery, and there's one particular grave which is very important. It's where Saint Columba's mother is buried, Saint Ethne. He buried her here rather than on Iona, because at the time Iona was an exclusively male island. They were very clear at the time between separating islands for nuns and islands for monks. The way the Holy Mountain, Athos, functions today. So she's buried here, and this is where the old cemetery is located. Everything you see around here, except this building, everything else are ruins from the 13th, 14th century, when the Benedictine monks moved in after the Celts had abandoned the islands and the monastery, and they rebuilt a monastery on the places where the Celtic monastery was located. That tiny little thing over there is in fact this building, and it was the church of the monastery. And this is much older than these ruins. This is the only one among this structure that goes back to the first millennium. So out of everything here, this is the only building going back to the 900s. It's still very, very tall. I mean, it's taller than I am, so it must be like this. We celebrated the Divine Liturgy several times inside, but it's not a good place precisely because the walls are very high and the wind doesn't get inside, which makes it ideal for midges. So you end up celebrating in a spirit of peace, and you end up celebrating in a spirit of God, kill them. And it's not really the right approach. Actually, the solution proved to be that we wear masks. But I'm always afraid, I don't know how, but I'm always afraid someone else might come on the island while we're there and they'll find this group of 10, 11 masked people just worshipping, and that's not a good image for Orthodoxy. It couldn't really happen because the island is not inhabited. That's something else that I should mention to you.
They didn't know what midgets are. They're little.
Not midgets. Midges.
Midgets. Yeah. Midgets. Oh. Gnats.
They are very, very small creatures. No. Did I say midget? Wait a second. Did I say midget? No, midges. You said midget. You did say midget. Okay. I'm only asking because I've done this before.
Yeah, you're.
Okay. The previous time I've done this, I could see on the faces of the people around me that something was wrong, and I was trying to explain what they are, and I kept saying there are all these thousands and thousands of midgets coming out of the bushes, and we keep killing them. But I'm sorry, it's not my language. Anyway. Yes, lots of. They are very, very small, vicious creatures that actually bite.
I think we call them no-see-ums too.
I think the no-see-ums don't bite you,
They don't.
but the midges do, and they seem to be particularly hungry, and they do like American blood. I think there's a lot of sugar in your blood, and they anyway. Assuming you survive the midges, there are other places on the island where we can celebrate, and those are actually the oldest, the beehives. The beehives on the island are the only structures that go back to the 500s. And they are therefore the most important. The only reason why they survived here on this island, and they haven't survived anywhere else in the Hebrides, is that this island is very small, it's very difficult to live there, and it only has one tiny source of water. So it was abandoned. After the Benedictines built their monastery, and after the Reformation forced the Benedictines away, the island was abandoned, and since then it's not been inhabited. There are sheep on the island. They sometimes bring them in the spring in order to keep the vegetation more or less under control, but nobody lives on the island. And when there are no humans, history survives better, because there's no one there to take down a 500 monument to build a house or a fence. That's why they survived. So in these beehives, we do try to celebrate. They all look the same. It's the same structure as in Ireland, and it's actually the structure that you also find in the Egyptian desert. If you go to St. Anthony's Monastery in Egypt, you'll find the same beehives. They are called beehives, by the way. After my experience with the midges, I should explain this. They have nothing to do with bees. It's just the structure. They look like an igloo. Maybe I should call them igloos. But they are monastic cells. This is actually unique, and I think it's unique in Scotland itself. It goes back, as I told you, to the 500s, and it's also a double beehive. And because we know that double beehives were only used by abbots or the priests of a community, we know with historical accuracy and certainty that this is where St. Brandon himself must have lived. This is his cell, which is quite amazing for someone who has become almost a mythological sort of creature, to be able to stand and to touch, stone that he probably personally used to build his own cell. Because I'm sure they were not, employing builders to put up the beehives. You can see that, there's obviously a structure there, one beehive there, and there's a second one here, which is more or less collapsed. But still, this is as high as my head, my neck. You'll see in another photograph. And they are connected through a door. And he would have used this one or this one, we don't know. But he would have used one of the two for his own personal use. And the other one he would have used to receive brothers and hear confessions or offer advice. You can see better somehow from these photos.
So there's no mortar was used.
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. And it's interesting because in a previous photograph, I've actually asked this. See, this, which is from the first millennium again, is much higher and in a better condition than any of the other ruins nearby from the 14th century. So although this is older by 4 centuries at least, it still stands in a better condition than the other ones. And I've asked someone who is a builder, who came on a pilgrimage, and that's what he explained to me, that in the first millennium they used no mortar. So they would have, if you had 2 rocks, and you can see them, 2 rocks would be like this, they would have to fit perfectly. And if there's no mortar in between, they will still be like this until somebody takes them down. If you use mortar, it made building easier, because if you have a rock like this and then the next one has to be straight, you can put stuff in between. The problem is that in time, that stuff, that mortar, will be eaten away by the wind and the rain, and this will happen to the, and then the whole structure will fall down. So that's why, you know, the newer structures are actually in worse condition, much worse condition than the ones from the first millennium. And the beehives, yes, they have absolutely no mortar. And we do try to celebrate the Divine Liturgy every time we can, and that every time we can, is actually conditioned by the weather. I don't remember, have we celebrated when we went there?
Not there, no.
Not in the beehive.
No, I think we did. I can't remember which. Yeah, I think we did.
It's very difficult to do it if it rains, obviously, but sometimes you get tricked into it, in the sense that you do give the blessing for the Divine Liturgy, and then everything is beautiful, the skies are wonderful, and then 5 or 10 minutes later into the service it starts pouring with rain. So the only, well, there are solutions, basically umbrellas. You just end up rebuilding the beehive with umbrellas. And I have people around me, 3-4 people, just covering what we call the holy table, which is actually my backpack. So that at least there's no water. Another danger, of course, are the seagulls, that are suddenly very, very interested in our Prospera. And I need to have a Prospera guardian. And again, the seals, which is why I don't like them. They stay there, they don't come close, they stay there in their place, but they just decide to have fun and play around and splash around while we celebrate. And guess where the attention of all our pilgrims is? It has nothing to do with what I'm doing there, it has to do with those pups. Anyway, this is a very nervous monk, as you can see. But moving on from St. Brandon, about two decades, 23 years later, 22, 23, St. Columba arrived to Iona himself. He didn't come alone, he came with 12 other monks. He landed in 563. And do you know anything about St. Columba apart from the name and Iona? Who knows something more? Like why he left Ireland, for instance? Okay. All right. Well, it's not a long story, and it's an interesting story. It could hopefully help us appreciate books more, because it all had to do with a book. In those times, in the there was this unwritten law, well, all of them were really, that if Father owned an illuminated manuscript, a manuscript of this Gospel or of the Psalter, and I borrowed it from him in order to create a copy, although I was the one who wrote one copy, doing all the work, and I put my own money, my own materials and all of that, at the end, when I would return the original to Father, I would have to give him the copy as well. Because the copy, by law, belonged to the owner of the original. Yes, of the original. Well, St. Columba borrowed a copy of the Psalter from his spiritual father, actually, St. Finian. But at the end, after he made his own copy, he decided that's not fair. And I'm going to keep it. And of course that created, well, unhappy feelings between the two saints. And unhappy feelings between two saints are reflected in hatred in the tribes that the saints belong to. So that generated battles, real battles, where human lives were lost. And because Saint Columba was the one who had broken the law, he was sent into exile by the church. And he must have felt very, very guilty himself, because he could have just stayed on one of the many, islands around Ireland for a while until he did his repentance, and then he could have went back to Ireland. But instead of that, he decided to sail as far as necessary, as far north as necessary, as to no longer be able to see his home country anymore. And if you remember those maps I showed you at the beginning, he left Ireland and he kept traveling. So Ireland would be here somewhere. He kept sailing north, further and further, landing in various places. And we know some of these places where he landed. They still carry his memory until he reached the south of Iona. And that's where, looking back, from the bay where he landed, still known as St. Columba's Bay, looking back, he could no longer see his home country. So they decided to stay there. There is actually on the bay, at the center of it, this hill, which is known, it has a name on all maps as the Hill of the Turning Back to Ireland. That is where St. Columba climbed to make sure that Ireland was no longer visible. And since he couldn't see it anymore, they decided to just live on Iona. And in time, going through a lot of temptations, I'll mention some of it later, they ended up creating perhaps the greatest, at one point at least, monastery in Western Europe, the monastery on Iona. And this is not the original building. All of this was rebuilt in the late 1800s, even beginning of the 1900s, so it's quite recent, but it is placed on the location where the original monastery was established. That tiny little thing there, do you see it on top of the hill? You'll see that everywhere in the Isles, and it marks the highest place on the island. And it's a place where, by tradition, they were performing human sacrifices as part of their pagan rituals. The population of the Isles before St. Columba arrived was pagan, and they were sun worshippers. So they were offering all sorts of sacrifices, including human sacrifices, in these highest places of the islands. The last thing I want to mention concerning St. Columba are the high crosses, because at one point there were over 300 of them. But some historians say that the number was 365, one per calendar year. And they are very, very high. I mean, they are 1 or 2 meters higher than the room, some of them. Out of those 360 something that existed in the first millennium, St. Martin's Cross, which is this one, is the only one that still survives in its original location. All the others were destroyed, all the others were just completely, some of them were thrown in the seas around Iona. And that's not the work, the doing of the Vikings. This is entirely what happened at the Reformation. And the main reason was that they were all covered in iconography. Even St. Martin's, if you pay attention, this is an icon of the Mother of God holding Christ as a child, with the 2 archangels to the sides. The next one shows 2 lions and the prophet in the den. The lions on both sides and the prophet in between. I know for sure this is St. David playing the harp, and this is Saul. Every single layer has an icon, and at the time, in the first millennium, those sculpted icons would have been painted as well. So, for that reason, at the Reformation, they were taken down. Many of them were used or reused as building material for homes, stables, fences, and so on. And some of them were thrown in the seas. In some ways, that was a good thing to do, because those were the only ones that they could save later on. So in the seas around Iona, they found the remains of 3 other crosses. This, which is this one, is St. Oran's cross. The one behind, which is almost lost, I mean, they only have the base and 1 arm. That's St. Matthew's cross. And this is St. John's cross. I'm actually wearing a replica of St. John's cross. It is a very important, if not the most important Celtic cross that we have, because historically it is the oldest visual representation that we know of a Celtic cross. It cannot have been the oldest. There must have been at least, in some manuscripts, drawn ones. But this is the only one, the earliest one that still survives. And just as an idea how old it is, instead of having icons like all the others or the ones I showed you before, it's covered with pagan symbolism. All of these are pagan symbols of eternity, the snake nest, the snake kind of curling until it reaches its own tail. Also on Iona, there's another saint, Saint Oran, of whom almost no one has heard. I mean, if we knew so little about Saint Columba, I can only imagine that, even the name Oran is unknown to most of us. And I made it a sort of a personal mission to talk about Saint Oran to everyone who's willing to listen, because I just love him. I absolutely love Saint Oran. I think among the Celtic saints, he and Saint Brendan are the ones I feel closest to, and between the two, because my first bachelor degree was in economics, so I have this thing of top 10, top 5, top 3, and who's on and I'm always, it's like a battle in my mind all the time. Who do I love most today? Saint Nicholas or Saint Seraphim, Saint Brendan or Saint Oran? And every day it changes, and every day you have the blessing of one saint that you feel closer to, and the guilt of not feeling closer to the other one, which is a good balance to have for a monk. Saint Oran, and I'll just very briefly mention the one thing that defined his life. Saint Oran was one of those first 12 monks who sailed north with Saint Columba. And he landed with Saint Columba in 563 on Iona. He was part of their attempts to build the first churches there. But what they noticed very soon was that everything they built collapsed just as soon. They would build something, next week it would be down. They would rebuild it, next week it would collapse. And I can definitely identify with that, because everything I've tried to do at Kilninian so far has not collapsed physically, but collapsed legally at least. So I was not allowed to continue. And then one night, Saint Columba had a vision. He had a vision of one of the local gods, a demon, that told him that on Iona, nothing gets built, nothing gets founded without a human sacrifice. Which is why I wanted you to see that place of human sacrifice, because it affects the Christian history of the island. And when Saint Columba told his monks that this was going on, and they were getting ready to leave the island and find a better place, Saint Oran, who was the oldest among them, offered to be buried alive as the sacrifice upon which the first Christian church should be built on Iona. And that's why in the icons that we have of him, he's usually depicted with a very long white beard. I'm not trying to suggest anything further, but he looks very much like him. Not that you should be buried alive, but he was the foundation of everything. And he is looking down into his grave, which is built underneath the foundation of this geometrical structure, a very, very simple chapel that is in fact this one. It is still known as St. Oran's Chapel. It's placed on the same structure as the original one, and out of everything that was built on that island in the first millennium, everything, the big churches, all the beehives, all the other buildings they had, the 300 and something Celtic crosses, out of everything that was built in the first millennium, the only building from the first millennium that still stands is St. Oran's Chapel. The very first one, and also the very last one to still stand. Because that was built on such love. I mean, that's the definition of perfect love. There is no greater love than to lay down your life for your brother and your sister. And he's done it in a physical way, in a most physical way. And there's something about him that if you approach him, and he's one of those saints that you can only approach with equal love and awe because I don't want to say fear. Fear has many shades to it, but there's a certain kind of fear that is in fact awe at what someone, a saint, can do. And if you approach him that way, it's just, he's the kindest among the kindest saints you have ever met.
Did he actually go through with it?
Yes, they built him in. That is the story. That is the story of his life, which is again unthinkable. I was absolutely scandalized the first time I read the life. I thought this is not Christianity, it cannot be, blessed in any way. And then I remembered, what are you doing, you stupid monk? My name is Seraphim. My name is Seraphim, and Saint Seraphim of Sarov in the 1800s, in confession, asked one of his nuns, Mother Helena, to die on behalf of her brother, because he had received a vision from the Mother of God, who told him that that brother would soon die, and that brother was the main benefactor of the monastery, and the death of that benefactor meant the death of the monastery. So Saint Seraphim, in confession, asked the benefactor's sister, who was one of his nuns, are you willing to do this? And if you do this, I promise you before God that the two of us will stand together before God. I promise you salvation. And she said yes, and 40 days later she died. This is from the 1800s, not the 500s. And today, if you go and you visit the monastery in Divevo, the monastery that was built, there are 6 incorrupt bodies in the church, plus Saint Seraphim. And among those 6, the first one is Mother Helena. She was found perfectly incorrupt.
Once that took place, was there ever any known issue recorded of ever having a problem building anything again?
No, that's what the
So it
thing.
dispelled the whole thing.
It just dispelled the whole thing. Once they build that one, there's nothing else recorded. And you have to, of course, all
It
this.
took a sacrifice it couldn't.
It took the one sacrifice that went beyond any other sacrifice, because first of all, it was willing. It was what he offered. It was in the name of Christ, not in the name of anything else. And the same action, if you do the absolute same action, one, you do it for the sake of, something in the world, or another demon or God or something, and you do the same action but in the name of Christ, one will change the world, the others will just collapse and turn to dust, because only what you do in the name of Christ will last. And as proof, again, the one thing that still stands from the first millennium is the St. Lawrence Chapel. In the cemetery, he was the first one, the first Christian to be buried in the Isles. And then the cemetery, all those monks from the 500, 600, 700s just crammed around him to be buried with him. And we do the same. We try to celebrate the Divine Liturgy. It's the most beautiful place to be inside, and I love everything there. I love the acoustics. I love the simplicity of it. I love that it's so just raw. Everything is very raw. There's nothing extra. I don't know how to put it. Everything is reduced to the skeleton of it. If you don't pray, there's nothing that you can use to distract your attention, as you can do in most places I have been. It's so easy to trick my mind that I'm praying in a beautiful church with all sorts of beautiful icons and all sorts of lovely objects and other people around me, but in something that's just bare like that, and you're standing on the place where a human being was buried in order to make it possible for you to pray. Boy, there's such fear. It's almost like if you fail to pray, or at least fail to try to pray, it's almost like you're making a mockery of the sacrifice that man has had to go through for you to be able to be there that day. And that really helps. At least me, it helps me a great deal to pray. The only danger there, of course, are, again, our singers, and by that I don't mean the pilgrims, I mean these singers. Lots of birds there, and they do sing beautifully, but they also have a special way of blessing us that I'm not particularly fond of. But umbrellas, again, can be very useful, particularly above the altar. The last thing I want to mention about Iona, and I want to make this not about Iona, but about Mull as well, and every single other island in the Hebrides, are the martyrs. There is a group of them called the Holy Martyrs of Iona who have been canonized and recognized as saints even by the Orthodox Church. I say even because we know so little about them. And they do have a feast day, I think in July sometime. But their story is common everywhere in the Isles. It's not just on Iona. Already in the late 600s, the first attacks of the Vikings began. And in, I think, 680, if I remember correctly, the first major attack happened on Iona itself, which was the main monastery. And on that one day, one attack, 68 monks were killed in one strike. The description of the day was that there was so much blood that the ocean turned red from the blood, which is why we painted the ocean red. And we painted them white to symbolize their holiness and their willingness to hold on to Christ's commandments and not pick up a gun to protect their lives, but to die in order to belong to Christ eternally. Of course, that meant that in this lifetime their lives was completely crushed and nothing came out of it. They were complete failures. But we know of another failure who ended up on a cross, naked and abandoned by everyone, and who proved to be quite a success in the kingdom. So similarly, they chose to be a success in the kingdom rather than here in this life. And there are two places on Iona. One of them is known as the Martyrs' Bay, where this particular attack took place, and 68 of them were killed in one attack. And then there's another place called the White Strand of the Monks, where the last main attack took place in the 800s, 860, 870. And that was so gruesome that it actually led to the abandonment of the island. So after that particular attack, which took place on Christmas Eve, and they killed, including the monks who were in the church celebrating, the abbot himself was killed in that, on that particular occasion. After that they left. Most of them returned to Ireland, and some of them went south on the other side of England, really, to Lindisfarne. That's why they had been creating all these other monasteries to the south as safer places in case they needed to hide somewhere. So White Strand of the monks is here. This is Mull, by the way. So Mull is very, very close to Iona. And in the museum on Iona, the same place where you see St. John's Cross and those three crosses that were salvaged from the sea, you also find things like this. This is a grave stone, a grave slab for a mass burial place. Because when 68 of your brethren are killed in one day, it's physically impossible to build 68 crosses, one for each of them. So you bury them all in one grave and you put on top of them something like this. You draw or you sculpt several crosses to say this is actually a place where more than one human beings are buried, and that's the end of it. And this is the only one that still survives, or the only one they found so far, marking places of mass martyrdom, mass burial. We're done with Iona, and we are moving to the last island, the third, and the last of the saints I want to talk to you about today, St. Kenneth. St. Kenneth is also one of those 12 traveling north from Ireland with St. Columba, like St. Oran. He lived on Iona for a while, for a few years, and then he felt this calling to a more secluded, sort of silent life. So he moved to a tiny little island, which is now known as Inch Kenneth, the little island of Kenneth, where he lived in a cave. That's why he's depicted in a cave. And that cave is again very, very close to Mull. That's why I've included that in our icon. In fact, this is Iona, and Inch Kenneth is here, which is about, by boat, 3 hours of rowing to get there, or sailing to get there. Actually, while I'm here, just as an idea, because they may seem like they were completely cut away from each other, and that's not really the truth. Just here, you have the monastery of St. Columba and St. Oran, all the saints, on Iona. You have Inch Kenneth here, there are two caves on Mull, McKinnon's cave and the Priest's cave, where we know that Christian hermits lived. Alba and Gometra had Christian presence on them, these two islands here. Kilninian is here, and there are also old ruins on these islands as well. So you basically have more or less a monastic lake of sorts. So although they were separated from each other, and it did take hours, to row from one place to another, they weren't really alone. There was a sense of community. And the same applies in this direction as well. You have again St. Columba's monastery here, St. Brandon is over there, and on this side there are two other caves, Score Cave and the Nuns Cave. I'll show you a few photos from the Nuns Cave as well. So these nuns here, they had St. Columba on this side and St. Brandon on the other side. Take your pick in terms of, spiritual direction. But anyway, this is where St. Kenneth lived. And when you go to Inchkenneth today, which is this island here, we go there by sailing boat, and that is Mull. Again, I want you to see how close actually everything can be. You see the ruins of the Benedictine monastery that was established there, the same in the 13th, 14th century, so 2-3 centuries after the island was abandoned by the Celtic monks. Inside you can pray, and we try to pray every time we get there. And again, because it's not an uninhabited island, but it is privately owned. So it's owned by just one family. There is one house on that island, and they come there once a year for a week or 2 weeks. So you could say it's uninhabited. And because of that, some of the best sculptures in the Hebrides are still preserved. I mean, compare this with what you've seen previously in the other photographs. This is actually quite good for the resurrection. You have one of those hourglasses, and this is a human skull and the trumpet of the apocalypse. And the words, "Arise, you dead." It's just inscribed there. But anyway, from the ruins of the monastery, if you go down into the bay and you take a left turn, and I love that left turn, I mean, all you see is this, and you can walk and pray to your heart's desire, you will eventually get to the cave. The cave where St. Kenneth lived as a hermit. And as it happened at Kilninian, the same thing happened here. He came here to live alone as a hermit. In time, a few other brethren came to join him, a small community was formed, a monastery appeared, and then St. Kenneth left. Because that's not what he wanted. But the monastery survived for a long time until again the Viking attacks. And we do the same thing every time we go there. We try to pray. I think we read St. Patrick's breastplate in there. It's a brilliant place to read the breastplate, just surrounded by stone and looking out at the ocean and just feeling the breeze hitting you. These are all the saints around Mull, and I did think what to show you from Mull itself. And I settled on the Nuns Cave because it is one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful hike that I've personally made. The photographs will not do it justice because I was in a rush to kind of put it together, but I hope you'll appreciate it. There are 4 Christian caves on Mull in total. Out of these 4 caves, in 2 of them, we have physical evidence of Christian presence, because on the walls of the cave there are sculpted crosses. And in one of them, a small one called Score Cave, you have from the 500s pagan symbolism, such as there's a labyrinth and a lot of those pagan snakes sculpted in the walls. Just by them, from the same century, the first crosses appear. So you see it visually in stone, the conversion of the local population from paganism to Christianity. I don't know of any other place in the UK where you can see that in stone. The Nuns Cave, though, is about an hour and a half of a most beautiful, beautiful hike. And this is the only photograph I've decided to share with you of the truth of about, I don't know, 60% of our time. Instead of waiting for the 5 minutes when it's sunny, so I can take a good photograph to share with you, I thought maybe one photograph won't hurt. It very frequently looks like this, but it's still beautiful. I mean, I actually prefer it this way. I prefer it because it feels like there's nothing outside yourself. Like the world ends there. There's nothing but you and God, and there's no pesky world to kind of draw your attention from everything. But then you kind of walk for about an hour and a half, depending how quickly you move. You pass these pools, which were actually vital. These pools were absolutely vital, essential for the survival of the early monastics, because they are only created at low tide. You have high tide and low tide, low tide, twice a day. But at every low tide, when the ocean, this is where the ocean is at high tide, withdraws, you have these pools in which you find captive fish, captive, crabs, oysters, all sorts of goodies that you can go and collect, and that they will keep you alive. As long as you get there before the birds. That's something to keep in mind. You have to get there before the birds. Eventually, after about an hour and a half of walking, you get to the cave. This is the entry to the nuns' cave. The cave itself is, I think, larger than this room. It was used by a community. The other one that I mentioned with the pagan symbolism close to the Christian symbolism, that's much smaller. It's about just this square here, and that was clearly a hermit's place. And inside the cave, there's a collection of crosses, among which some of them, about 5 or 6 of them, are dated to the 500s, the 6th century, so the same time that St. Columba and St. Brendan were also present in the isle. There are lots of them, some of them are older, some of them are more recent. This is also the 500s, and what's left of that one. That's much more recent, because the Celtic Cross appeared much later in their times. And this is, of course, us. It kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the place. Trying to pray as well. It's not a place I would love to spend the night there, and I would love to celebrate there, but it is the one place where I have not quite brought myself to celebrate the Divine Liturgy, because everywhere here on this beautiful floor there are tiny little gifts from the wild goats. They take shelter there when there's a storm or when it's really a strong wind, and they just poop everywhere. It's not something you want around the holy table. And that's the last photograph, which is very close to Kildinian. I just need to be reminded why I'm doing what I'm doing, so this photograph is quite useful for that. That's pretty much what I wanted to share with you. I mean, I've got lots of other photographs and videos and all of that, but I think that's more than enough to give you a taste of what the monastery is, where it is, why we want to be the way we are, and also what you get if you come on a pilgrimage, which is almost half the cost of what I've seen out there. So thank you for having me, and do ask me any questions if you have any.
Father, why don't you talk about St. Brendan's, the number of...
Just a second, the lady behind you.
Oh,
Let's pretend we are British.
I was on Mull and briefly and on the Isle of Iona for 24 hours in about 1980. And I remember praying in Columba, so this was before we were Orthodox. So I didn't know anything about anything. And I remember the new church and everything, but for some reason I had the impression that it wasn't the original, and I remember that there were some ruins in a different area. So, and of course, I didn't hear anything about St. Laurent or wasn't conscious of that chapel. But what were the ruins then of the original church?
In other sides of Iona, in what they call the desert part of Iona, there are ruined beehives, but only 2 of them that I know of. And they call it the Hermit's Cell. There's also a well that's dedicated to Saint Bridget on Iona.
Okay.
And there's also the place of the hut where Saint Columba lived. There's a hill just in front of the big abbey, known as the hill where St. Columba's hut was located. There's nothing else.
I just remember ruins of what I thought was a small chapel, but anyway. So I wanted to-
That would have been there was the nuns
It's never been, St. Oran would have looked like this in the 80s, yeah.
near the time of the Benedictines, isn't there nuns?
Oh, the nunnery, you mean?
The nunnery.
But you would have
that's
seen
one
that,
of them.
but you would have seen that, you can't get to the abbey except through the nunnery.
Okay.
But yes, indeed, there's a nunnery built in the 14th century. So when the Benedictine monks moved to the island, they no longer followed the restrictions of St. Columba, and they no longer had Iona reserved only for monks. So they rebuilt the men's monastery, and then very close to it they built a nunnery for nuns, and that's also there in ruin. In some way that doesn't even exist in my mind, because I'm so focused on the first millennium. Yeah, but in that nunnery there's a very interesting little room that I always like to point out to our pilgrims. There's a room about the size of I don't know, maybe a bit longer than that screen up to here, and a square, and it is the room where they had a stove. The room where they had a stove. So those must have been quite strong nuns. And remember, this is the 1400s. Can you imagine the 500s of St. Columba or St. Brendan? That's when I tell people that we definitely project a lot over that millennium, and we make up a lot of things. We just assume things. Oh, it's an island, and the saint was just walking the coast, and light was following him. He was probably dead tired, dead hungry, cold to his bones, and wondering, why am I here? Do I want to do this? Why don't I go somewhere else? I mean, there's a battle behind any monk and any monastery that we forget about, and we just rewrite somehow their lives in a very romantic sort of way. Even those attacks, I mean, 68 monks, 68 men who could survive in that environment and not to lift one finger to protect themselves. That's what makes it amazing. Not 68 of me, because I would have had a heart attack the minute I see them. That's the end of it. But that was just pure will, pure just faith and will. I'm sorry, yes.
I was just saying, maybe you could talk a little bit about St. Brendan and his, I think this is right, that he founded many different, monasteries, and he was, he was very, very mobile, the navigator.
Yes, he's known as Brendan the Navigator for a good reason. And actually, that's the reason why in the Hebrides, although he arrived way before St. Columba, and St. Columba himself looked up to him, his influence is not that kind of visible today, because he kept on moving. And he kept on moving because he had a personal understanding of what a monk or a nun really is. And he refused to allow himself to grow familiar to one particular place. Every time he would establish a community, he was there for a while, a few months, maybe a year, until the community took roots and was safe to leave them, and then he would leave and go somewhere else and establish another one and leave again, and so on and so forth. He simply, forgive me, just fought never to become familiar anywhere in this world, never to grow roots anywhere in this world, and to always remember that we belong somewhere else. The downside of that is that, of course, the influence that he personally had is not as obvious of that as Saint Columba, for instance, who came to Iona and he lived there until he died. So when you're in the same place for a few decades, of course, your presence is being felt. But the upside of that is that, I don't know, you're on fire all the time. And I think that's worth the sacrifice. There's something about St. Brendan that makes him out of this world in almost the same way and the same extent to which Saint Oran is out of this world. He simply doesn't fit anything. He doesn't, even in a way, it reminds us what a monk really is and what a monk should be, rather than what we imagine a monk or a nun are today. According to our standards today, he is a horrible monk. Because today we have decided that monks or nuns are only those monastics who live for their entire life in one given place. But you look at the history of the church and you see these huge saints. I mean, these are not just some monks or some nuns that you can use as an excuse. These are huge saints who fit nothing. They don't fit any sort of, formula concerning monastic life. And it's very important, I think, to remember these exceptions. Although they were not exceptions, there were lots of them. But it's important to remember that, because otherwise we lose our own tradition, we lose our own. I know the word diversity is not a good word to use today, but the reality is that our tradition was immensely and endlessly diverse. You find all sorts of crazy monks and crazy nuns, all of whom have been recognized as saints by the church. John.
Yeah, wasn't also one of the important things, wasn't the Book of Kells created?
The Book of Kells is known as the Book of Kells because that's where it was taken to be kept safe from Iona. So the Book of Kells was actually made and painted, written on Iona itself. And it's part of the reason why our icons look the way they do. I strive as much as I can to create icons that follow something of what would have been a Celtic style of painting icons. And really what that is going back to the first 3-4 centuries of Egyptian iconography. Because again, the first missionaries coming from Egypt, they brought with them the beehives, they brought with them their icons. And it's very easy, if you just look at Egyptian icons, again from the first 3-4 centuries, and you look at the icons that you find in the Book of Kells, you'll see the similarities are just striking. And the colors, the shapes, the style, everything is there. Yeah, Iona was a place of great education and a learning center.
You said it was St. John's Cross that's covered with kind of pagan symbols. Were those symbols placed simply to be decorative, or were there things in their symbols that they had inherited that they found kind of opened the pathway for them understanding the gospel when it was presented? Like, were there things about those symbols
Definitely.
specifically that echoed
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, the very cross itself, the Celtic cross, was created not by accident, but with a missionary sort of purpose. When you look at a Celtic cross, what you are looking at really is an image of the crucifixion, when you have Christ crucified on the cross. Only that because the local population was pagan, and because they were worshipping the sun, so their god was the sun, the physical sun, the early missionaries created this connection between Christ and the sun as the real God. There's somewhere in the scripture Christ is described as the sun of righteousness, the true light of the world. And that's why instead of sculpting a Christ crucified on the cross, they added the sun, the local god, as an image of Christ crucified on the cross. This is basically the physical sun being crucified. And the symbols that they selected all point to eternal life, the idea of salvation and eternity. They are not just randomly used. They've done the same with human sacrifices. That's why it's amazing to think that in that bloodthirsty sort of pagan world where they had human sacrifices and nothing was really forbidden, it's amazing to think that those people were converted to a religion of love and forgiveness and complete abandonment to God without one single battle. There's not one single battle that took place. There's not one martyr in the Isles recorded. The martyrdoms happened at the end of their history. So they managed to convert an entire nation, an entire country, an entire part of the world with no battle and no human sacrifice And the result of that is that they ended up being butchered in return.
Well, and then the Vikings converted too, right?
And one of the side effects of all of that is that the Vikings converted. When you are as crazy as God wants you to be, as to follow His commandments and just blatantly and visibly reject the world's values, first, that's going to kill you, obviously, either metaphorically or physically. But the side effect is that you really become a reminder, a true reminder of how out of this world Christ really is, and that we are called to be out of this world. See, I do believe that's the main problem that we face today. Each of us, I mean, not who am I to speak about anyone else, but about myself definitely, that instead of being a Christian, I've become a very good citizen rather than a Christian. There's nothing of my life that can inspire people to the degree that one single of those monks just not fighting back, although they could have, that doesn't happen anymore. We've become just good, like house pets instead of lions. That's what we are, poodles by comparisons. And that fails to inspire the world. And then we are amazed that the world is not really responding, the world is not converting, the world is just rejecting us.
Is that a comment and a question? The same thing happened in Rome with the early icons. Christ was Apollo. They used the image of Apollo and the image of Zeus to represent Christ.
Yeah.
Apollo was also the sun god. Now I was wondering about all the fantastical elements that are in the story of St. Brendan. Was that something added later? Was that a medieval kind of thing, or?
My attitude to all of that is that I take it as reality. I just take it as reality, even if historically, and I don't mean just St. Brendan, but pretty much everything about the life of the saints, because even if it's not historically accurate, there's something that happened exactly as that myth presents it to us now. There's always a reason why the myth went that way and not the other way. And I'm not really interested in the history anyway. It's not relevant to me if St. Brendan, I don't know, lived or died at the beginning of the 600s or the middle of 600s. It's irrelevant to me if he actually made it to America or he didn't make it to America. What's relevant is that there is something in his life that can become again inspiring for me. And we have a lot of examples of things that were held simply in virtue of tradition and were kind of laughed at by historians that proved to be true eventually. One good example is I mentioned, because of your question, that hut of St. Columba. Until about 4 or 5 years ago, there was just a tradition that on top of that hill in front of the abbey, that's where St. Columba's hut was located. That was passed on and on from generation to generation. That's what tradition held. But historically, there was absolutely no proof. In the 60s and the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of archaeological diggings that happened at Iona, including in that hill to find out what's there. And they found all sorts of pebbles, they found old wood carbonized by now, and all of that. They couldn't date it then because it was too expensive to carbon date. It wasn't as readily available as today. About 10-15 years ago, when the leader of that expedition, archaeological digging, passed away, all his archive was passed to Scottish Heritage. And Scottish Heritage now has money. So they asked another team of contemporary historians to have a look at everything he owned. And in one plastic bag, there were just bits and pieces of carbonized wood that said the place of the hut, Iona. And they dated it. And it is from the 500s. It is from the 500s. It was one of the main pieces of news that hit the UK a few years ago, and it's easy to find it online. So after centuries and centuries of nothing except hearsay or just tradition, that held that that's the place where he lived. Now we know that indeed there was there in the 500s when he was alive a wooden hut, and they would have built of wood back then on Iona. There's also, I mean, you read from the story of Saint Brandon. You read about this trip of his that lasted for 3 years until potentially he reached America, and he describes islands that where, you know, as he was sailing by, the demons on the island spit fire at him. He describes islands where birds, there were tens and tens of thousands of birds just singing, you know, psalms to the Lord. He describes floating islands made of crystal that came out of nowhere. Yeah, of course. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, there was that wonderful project led by Tim Severin. If you've not heard of him, look him up. There's a DVD and it's available on YouTube, and there's a book as well. This man built by hand a boat the way that they would have built it in the 500s. And he recreated Saint Brandon's route. He just sailed the way Saint Brandon would have sailed. He ate the way they would have eaten, and he simply tried to do everything as authentic as possible. He did end up in America at the end of the trip, but more importantly, for me at least, he films. So there was this boat, and then there was a second boat, obviously helping him, filming him, documenting everything. They passed islands with dormant volcanoes. So those spitting fires could have existed. They've passed islands where there are now bird sanctuaries. Again, tens of thousands of birds really live in these just cliffs coming out of the ocean. I mean, all I hear is a dreadful noise. But God only knows what a saint's ears hear. But at least the birds are there and they are clearly vocal. And then, of course, you find icebergs. But they didn't have a word for iceberg. So he described what he visually saw. I see a floating tiny island made of crystal. Yeah, we call it iceberg today. So there are elements that we perceive as being just mythical, but I think with a bit of patience and just humility, I believe, although my mind doesn't quite allow me to, I just accept it. And then in time, all these wonderful things prove to be real.
I would say with that, we shouldn't discount the idea that these are men who are on the edge of the world and living a life of a whole different spiritual reality from what just the native base world is. So even though they may be coming across these things, okay, he may be seeing a volcano spitting out fire, and that's how he perceives it. But indeed, there may also be, like in the case of the saint who allowed himself to be buried, there may very well be spiritual realities taking place that he's also looking into.
That's why I said
the two things may be happening at the same time. So even though we may look at certain things and with our modern mind try to dispel it as, okay, well, this is just myth or whatnot, there's also a spiritual reality that's just as important as the natural reality. And the two may cross over at points, especially for a saint who's living this different life, off by themselves, and possibly seeing the blend of two realities at once in a very real way to them. So
that's why I said, I mean, what I heard were birds that were making a noise, but I don't have the ears of a saint. A saint could have heard really birds singing praises and psalms to the Lord. What I see is a volcano, but I don't have the eyes of a saint. I don't know what a saint sees there. But the reality, at least the physical reality of the trip, can no longer be rejected as, made up belief. It clearly could have taken place. The descriptions fit what we still see today if we were to make the trip today. And spiritually speaking, I just hold on to my faith in those saints. But I cannot claim to have heard those birds, sing psalms, and I cannot claim to say that I've seen demons spitting fire. I just believe that that's possible. Yeah.
If in the resurrection we still have people taking up roles of historians, I kind of wonder what looking back into the history of things will be.
Hopefully we won't care anymore.
It'll only tell more of the
After the
story of
yeah.
God is what I'm saying. Not a morbid curiosity of the past, but something that shows the beauty of what God's done through the whole narrative.
I think at the end of the time, there will be no narrative. I think the idea of a narrative belongs to this fallen world and has nothing to do with the experience of God's kingdom.
Beautiful description.
That's. You had a question.
I have a question more about you particularly. So all of the interest you have in the Celtic saints and this, did that all come just because you ended up in this position to purchase this monastery? Okay, so that's not where it was
Absolutely.
going.
100%. Yes. It's one of the most disappointing things about me. And there are so many, and there are so many. No, it's disappointing because I wish I had a more kind of extraordinary story about how Saint Columba one night came and woke me up and told me something in a vision. The reality is I just followed my hope, which was to live as far away and in as much silence as possible. And then one day God gave me this church. And I said yes to what I wanted, having no idea what I'm saying yes to. And then I went to Mull to see what I said yes to, and I discovered there's something called Iona. You Google it up and you discover, oh my God, what did I get myself into? You know, and that's how, I mean, I wasn't called in the sense of, you know, something extraordinary. I just followed what I felt would be true for me personally. And then God used that, as I always say, like a carrot in front of a stupid donkey, to just move me about and get me to do the things He wanted me to do.
That's still a
Another word
miraculous
people
story.
call
It's miraculous, but it doesn't rub well on my image. So it would have been a much better story if, anyway, you never know.
So, you didn't really grow up with any knowledge or love of the Celtic saints?
I didn't know that they existed.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Romanian.
Yeah, but in your...
We have enough saints, you know. It's like, that's what the Russians would say. We have enough saints. The Greeks, we have enough saints. Why would I even care? What the idea that there would be an Orthodox presence in the West is unthinkable. I mean, you have to understand the West does not have a good image spiritually in the East. Who is not Orthodox is a Satanist. I have heard this in my monastery during homilies given on the Sunday. It wasn't me saying it, but that's very, very common, even if it's not said as clearly as that poor father said it. And may God bless him for the he died in the meantime. But that is the attitude, that is the belief of a lot of monastics there. Who is not Orthodox is a Satanist. Why would I even conceive that there's holiness in the midst of Satanism? You know, I had no idea. It was like this big slap that God gave me to show me this reality that was hidden there for so long. And it's only now. I mean, look, I'm here in the West. You are, as Father said, a lot of you have ancestry from those islands. And I've asked you about one of the best known saints. Saint Columba is, speaking as an economist, in top 3. You know, and no one really knew much about his life. Why would a Greek, a Russian, Romanian, or Serbian know?
I didn't know if you had heard of the Celtic saints when you were in London doing your...
No, I knew of Saint Columba. I knew of Saint Cuthbert and Saint Bede because I started my PhD. I've done my PhD in Durham, and Durham is where, in the cathedral in Durham, and Durham itself actually was created to keep the relics of Saint Cuthbert and Saint Bede and the head of Saint Oswald. So I knew that they existed as saints. I knew that they are recognized by the Orthodox Church because they lived in the first millennium, but I had no idea that there's this big story that, you know, concerns all of them. I only found that out when I moved to Mull. Not moved to Mull, when I said yes to the church and then I started to look around.
Could you speak a little bit about Saint Ida?
Oh, you love your saint, don't
I
you?
do love Saint. And there's connections.
Yes, I mean, there are connections between all of them. Saint Ida, I-T-A, or Saint Ida, I-D-A. She is an amazing saint. In the Celtic Church, again, and I underline this is something we make up. It didn't exist. The Celtic Church per se did not exist as an institution. In the time of the Celtic saints in the first millennium, first of all, we must understand that monasticism was equally important as it was in Egypt. It wasn't, see, unlike Rome, where the church was more or less driven by what the bishop had to say, what the pope had to say, what the institution had to say. And that's why they ended up with this big architecture, big cathedrals, as symbols of power and so on. In Egypt and then in Ireland and in Scotland, everything was driven by monastics. And that's still the case in most of the Orthodox countries. Of course, the bishops are the ones who hold authority. They are the ones everybody obeys to. They are the ones who kind of rule the day. But when you draw the line, and 1 or 2 centuries have passed, looking back, pretty much nobody remembers the bishop, unless the bishop was a holy man. They remember the holy people. They remember the monks or the nuns, or the holy, they remember holiness. And the authority in the Catholic Church, as it still is in the Orthodox Church everywhere, did not belong to the institution, it belonged to holy people, men or women. And the Celts were very good at not discriminating or not creating unnecessary kind of discrimination between men and women. Of course, they didn't ordain women, they didn't ordain, they were fully Orthodox in their practice and theology, but they were very respectful in a way that we aren't anymore. And that created certain things that we don't see anymore in the Orthodox Church today. Among these things are the so-called holy women, the holy abbesses. And Saint Ita is an example. Saint Bridget is another example. Saint Hild or Hilda is another example. There are plenty of them. These were women who functioned or worked, spent their lives creating, establishing communities, monastic communities, both man communities, male communities, and women communities, and running them. They were abbesses over both male and female communities. In fact, there was this structure perfectly balanced between the mother, the abbess, and the father, who was the spiritual director. So you had a woman in charge of the administration and daily life of both types of communities, and you had a man in charge of the spiritual life of both communities. Perfectly balanced, perfectly at peace. In many of those places, and St. Ida's monasteries are one of the best examples, they had orphanages or schools where either real orphans or young kids that still had their parents but who could not afford to educate them would be taken. The Saint Ita, by some accounts, has received over 1,000 orphans in her communities and took care of them and educated them and just raised this generation of holy people, men and women. There are, I know of 4 or 5 among her orphans who were canonized in their own right. And there must be more, but I haven't put in the time or the effort to, do all the research. Among her orphans, and this is the connection that Matichka was suggesting, one of her orphans was Saint Brandon the Navigator. So Saint Brandon was actually received in one of Saint Ita's communities. He was educated, raised by her, and he respected her until the day she passed away. Whenever he would go away, for instance, on one of his trips, when he left on that extended trip for 3 years that ended or not in America, the blessing that he received, the blessing to go, was from Saint Ita, not a bishop, not anyone else. He would go to Saint Ita to receive his blessing. There are these beautiful connections. Saint Ita is still remembered in Irish folklore as the foster mother of Christ's saints. Christ creates these saints, and Saint Ita receives them and takes care of them, although she's not their mother, she's the foster mother for these Christ saints. And there are songs in Irish folklore that are known as St. Ida's lullabies, the songs that she sang to put to bed all these saints. That's just beautiful. And yeah, you can find, I mean, a lot of these stories, you can find out about them if you go on the monastery website and you just click on icons, or, you know, and I include some of the stories, I include the icons, all the icons, you know, if you like one particular saint, get one. That's why we paint them, that's why I put the effort into creating all these icons, because most, not many, I'd say 99% of the Celtic saints simply have no icons today. After a millennium of nobody really worshipping them, or forgive me, venerating them in the Orthodox Church, they are left with no icons. You may find some icons of St. Columba and St. Brendan because they are so well known, but there are literally hundreds. There's a full calendar with 3 or 4 Celtic saints at least every single day. I will give you actually, what's the time now, by the way?
Quarter to 12.
Quarter to 12. Let's finish here, because I think we are having something to eat, and then we are moving in the church for the second half. But I will give you now a leaflet and also an icon of St. Columba. On the back and inside that leaflet, you have the monastery website. A lot of everything I've told you and more actually is available there. So I would have, if you leave today with the knowledge that somewhere in the Celtic Isles, in Scotland, there were some Orthodox saints in the first millennium, and if you remember that these were linked with Orthodox Egypt, and that they are, you know, the saints of your ancestors, then I've done my bit. If you remember just that, because everything else, you find it online. And if you want to come and pray, well, that's why we organize our pilgrimages.
You know, Father, I think one of the other things that came across so vividly to me when we were there was they were seeking out not the places that were desirable, comfortable, pleasurable. They had the same desert mentality that I want to be in this place where there's no question that if I survive, it's because God has ordained it.
Well, they use the word, which is another, you know, heritage from, not real heritage, not quotation marks, from the desert. They use desert. So when they go sailing, they go into the desert. They don't go sailing in the ocean, or, you know, they go sailing in the desert. They are looking for a desert. They ask for a blessing to find a desert. That's always the way they describe it. And you're right, everywhere I was telling you that nobody sane lives on the western side of these isles. All the locations, the Celtic locations where these saints lived, are on the west side. They purposely put themselves in a place of danger, in a place of tension. They never sought, you know, the safety that we seem so kind of caught up in and dependent upon.
So the early monks, were they trained in Egypt themselves, or is the Egyptian monks, they came over to the British Isles?
History is not as clear as that. I wish it were. It would make things so much easier for everyone.
Right.
And particularly in the Isles, things are so complicated. Because again, we project a much more simpler reality on a much complex reality of theirs. We think of those two islands today, and we think of Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland. Well, they had hundreds of different tribes at the time. When someone like Saint Ninian, for instance, Saint Ninian lived in the 300s. He founded the first monastery that we know of in Scotland was founded by Saint Ninian in 397. That's the first century as the first monasteries in Egypt, or actually anywhere in the world. We don't have monasteries that are older than those ones. And we know that he traveled to the Isles. You've seen that there are wells, there are hills dedicated to the memory of Saint Ninian. So this saint who lived in the 300s traveled to the Isles, did missionary work, And then in the 500s, when St. Columba and St. Brendan arrived, everyone was pagan. Because what happens is, you have these tiny little places, and one tribe, which is pagan, will attack another tribe, which is Christian. And in 1 or 2 centuries, things get lost, and people revert back to paganism. So there's this migration that goes on constantly, like a soup that keeps on boiling. You can't always find the carrot in the same place. It will always be, moving about. So you have this, that's such a stupid image, but it's the way my mind works. And it tells you that I'm hungry. So, but you have these layers of paganism and then Christianity, and then again paganism and then again Christianity. In Ireland, we think of Saint Patrick, for instance, as the apostle to Ireland. But we know historically that there are saints that are canonized who lived in Ireland before Saint Patrick. We know that Saint Patrick, when he went there, he was a bishop. So he left, if I were to go, I don't know, somewhere where people haven't heard of, Christians today, I wouldn't become a bishop unless there were people there I could be the bishop of. So if there were other Christians, he simply brought back to Christianity, recreated the structure, and so on. We know, if you look in the listings of Irish saints that are held by Irish tradition, not even Orthodox, just Irish tradition, you will see that they go back and back and back. The very first listing is the 7 Desert Fathers, or 7 Egyptian Fathers. That's the way they are described. They have no idea when they came, where from, what their names were, but at the basis of everything, of Christianity there, they know that the very first ones were these crazy monks coming from Egypt. Let's eat.
Okay, that's good.
Did they come consciously? Did they know where they were going?
Probably further, again, how do we know? We just make things up. Because I'm a monk, the only reason I would leave is the reason that I've left, which is to look for a more secluded place. Already in the late 300s or 400s,